This is Wrigley Field, the most iconic stadium in MLB and the beating heart of Chicago baseball. Built over a century ago, it remains one of the most beloved ballparks in the world. With its ivy-covered walls, hand-operated scoreboard, and tight urban footprint, it defies modern stadium trends and stands as a living monument to baseball history. But keeping it that way hasn't been easy. From resisting night games for decades to undergoing major renovation, Wrigley has fought to preserve its past while adapting to the future. So, how did this century-old stadium survive in an era of billion-dollar mega arenas? This is the story of how Wrigley Field became MLB's most iconic stadium. Before it became the beloved home of the Chicago Cubs, Wrigley Field had a different name, a different team, and a very different future ahead of it. In 1914, it opened as Weeghman Park, named after Charles Weeghman, a businessman who owned the Chicago Whales, a team in the short-lived Federal League. Designed by architect Zachary Taylor Davis, this stadium, with a seating capacity of 14,000, was built in just 2 months at a cost of $250,000, around $7 million in today's money, an astonishingly small sum compared to the $1.5 billion price tags of modern super stadiums. But when the Federal League crumbled in 1915, Weeghman was left with a brand new stadium and no team to fill it. Rather than admitting defeat, he made a bold move that reshaped baseball history. He bought the Chicago Cubs and gave them a new home. By 1920, the team was thriving in what had been renamed Cubs Park, and the stadium was quickly earning a reputation as one of the most intimate and exciting venues. Unlike New York's Polo Grounds, which was known for its deep center field and sprawling footprint, Wrigley Field was smaller, tighter, and closer to its fans, creating an energy that would become a defining trait of the stadium. By 1921, William Wrigley Jr., the chewing gum mogul, became the majority owner of the Cubs, bringing his business savvy and vision to the franchise. In 1926, he put his stamp on history, renaming the ballpark to Wrigley Field, ensuring its place as a Chicago institution for generations to come. Then came 1937, a year that would redefine Wrigley Field's identity. That's when a bold idea took root, transforming the stadium's outfield walls with a lush layer of ivy, a feature that would become one of the most recognizable sights in baseball. That same year, the now famous hand-operated scoreboard was installed in center field, a relic of the past that, even today, stands stubbornly untouched by the digital age. By the 1940s, every other major league ballpark had installed lights for night games, but Wrigley resisted, committed to preserving daytime baseball. In 1941, plans were briefly made to install lights, but after Pearl Harbor, the 165 tons of steel intended for the project were donated to the war effort, and the idea was abandoned. It wasn't until 1988, over 50 years after the first ever MLB night game was played at Cincinnati's Crosley Field, that Wrigley Field installed lights, becoming the last MLB stadium to do so. The long-awaited change came under the Tribune Company, which had purchased Wrigley Field and the Chicago Cubs from the Wrigley family in 1981, ending over 6 decades of Wrigley ownership. Yet, despite modernization, the essence of Wrigley Field remained untouched, an enduring relic of baseball's golden age. But as the 21st century loomed, it faced a new challenge, one even tougher than the battle against night games. Could Wrigley Field survive in the modern era, or was its timeless magic at risk of fading away? The answer is coming next. By the early 2000s, Wrigley Field was showing its age. The cracks, both literal and figurative, were impossible to ignore. Concrete was crumbling, steel beams were corroding, and the player facilities, once considered cutting edge, were now embarrassingly outdated. Compared to the sleek, high-tech stadiums springing up across Major League Baseball, Wrigley was frozen in time. If Wrigley was going to survive, it needed to evolve. But the biggest challenge wasn't just modernizing the stadium, it was doing it without destroying its soul. In 2009, the Ricketts family acquired the Chicago Cubs and Wrigley Field from the Tribune Company. 4 years later, they unveiled an ambitious plan to restore and modernize the century-old ballpark.
Our goal was to preserve Wrigley Field so that the next generation of players will create lasting memories on the same field that so many Cub greats have played on.
Called the 1060 Project, after Wrigley's historic address at 1060 West Addison Street, it was a delicate operation, like performing surgery on a living monument. The first challenge was reinforcing the structure itself. Engineers discovered that parts of the upper deck had moved slightly over time, and the steel framework beneath the stadium had weakened. To stabilize the structure, workers installed 1,000 tons of high-strength steel, similar to the kind used in modern skyscrapers, carefully reinforcing the existing framework without altering Wrigley's classic appearance. Beneath the surface, crews poured 3,000 cubic yards of fresh concrete, replacing the old, crumbling foundation piece by piece. Every step had to be taken with surgical precision. One wrong move, and a part of history could be lost forever. But stabilizing the stadium was only part of the challenge. Wrigley's iconic ivy-covered walls, a defining feature since 1937, posed their own problem. Renovating the outfield meant rebuilding the brick wall behind the ivy, but removing the ivy itself would have been unthinkable. Instead, engineers developed a careful process. Temporary barriers shielded the ivy while workers reinforced the wall brick by brick. The original bricks, each weighing nearly 10 pounds, were carefully removed, cleaned, and reset in the exact positions they had occupied for decades. The ivy remained untouched, blending seamlessly into the newly fortified wall as if no changes had been made at all. While the outfield walls were being preserved, another transformation was happening beneath the stadium.
One of the things that I don't think we had a full appreciation for when we took control of the team was just how bad the player facilities really were. We had the worst facilities in baseball.
For years, Wrigley had been notorious for having some of the worst player facilities in Major League Baseball. The Cubs clubhouse was small, outdated, and lacked the training and recovery spaces found in modern ballparks. Expanding outward wasn't an option. Wrigley was surrounded by city streets and rooftop buildings, so engineers went underground. Beneath the ballpark, they constructed a 30,000 square foot, state-of-the-art clubhouse, roughly half the size of a football field, complete with a hydrotherapy room, cryotherapy chambers, a cutting-edge weight training facility, and a high-tech analytics room. The new clubhouse finally brought Wrigley's behind-the-scenes features into the modern age. For fans, the most notable change was the addition of two massive video boards, one in left field and one in right. Measuring 42 feet high and stretching 95 feet wide, roughly the length of a standard NBA basketball court, these high-resolution screens marked a dramatic shift for Wrigley Field, which had resisted digital displays for decades. Some fans feared the video boards would ruin the ballpark's old-school charm, but others welcomed the change. For years, the buildings surrounding Wrigley Field had turned their rooftops into prime viewing spots, offering fans a one-of-a-kind experience, watching Cubs games from high above the action, beer in hand, without ever stepping inside the stadium. It became an unofficial extension of Wrigley's charm, and some rooftop owners even struck profit-sharing deals with the team. But in 2015, everything changed. When the Cubs installed massive video boards, rooftop owners cried foul, claiming their once-perfect sightlines were now blocked or ruined. Lawsuits flew, tensions escalated, and the battle over Wrigley's skyline became nearly as heated as the games themselves. But despite the controversy, the renovations continued. The concourses were expanded, restrooms and concession stands were upgraded, and Wrigley Field was modernized without losing its historic charm. From its original 14,000 seats in 1914, the stadium had steadily grown through multiple expansions, reaching 35,000 by the 1960s and 39,000 by the late 1980s. Today, it holds 41,649 for baseball games, with luxury suites and open-air rooftop patios within the ballpark itself. Yet, even with all these upgrades, one thing never changed. The heart of Wrigley Field remained the same. The ivy still climbed the outfield walls. The manual scoreboard still stood in center field, operated just as it had been since 1937. Wrigley wasn't alone in balancing modernization with preservation. For example, Fenway Park upgraded its facilities while keeping the iconic Green Monster intact. But Wrigley took it a step further. It didn't just modernize, it reinforced, restored, and evolved. More than merely surviving, Wrigley Field has stood the test of time, outlasting generations. But as MLB embraces smart stadiums and AI-powered experiences, will this 100-year-old ballpark keep up? The answer may surprise you. Few ballparks in history have had to walk the fine line between tradition and modernization as carefully as Wrigley. And yet, through decades of expansion, controversy, and reinvention, it has remained one of the most beloved venues in all of sports. Financially, the renovation was a massive home run. The $575 million transformation, fully privately funded by the Ricketts family, a rarity in modern sports, would be worth $750 to $800 million today. The investment paid off in a big way, sparking a surge in ticket sales, sponsorship deals, and premium seating revenue, turning Wrigley into one of baseball's most profitable stadiums. Beyond the ivy-covered walls, the neighborhood thrived as bars, restaurants, and hotels boomed, fueled by the endless stream of fans and tourists. But the sports world is changing rapidly, and the expectations for stadiums are evolving with it. Around the league, teams are introducing immersive fan experiences, retractable roofs, AI-driven crowd management, and even augmented reality seating options. High-tech entertainment districts are being built around new ballparks, transforming stadium visits into all-day experiences. Compared to these ultra-modern facilities, Wrigley might seem like a relic. And yet, that's exactly what makes it irreplaceable. In an era where stadiums are constantly being torn down and rebuilt, Wrigley Field remains a reminder that history has value. Wrigley's greatest strength is its ability to offer something they never can: authenticity. More than 100 years after it first opened its gates, Wrigley Field continues to thrive. Not because it keeps up with the latest trends, but because it doesn't have to. It is proof that, sometimes, the best way to build the future is to preserve the past. And as long as baseball is played in Chicago, Wrigley Field will remain its beating heart. Ready to be amazed by the next groundbreaking construction project? Click on the video now and dive into a world where engineering and imagination collide. See you there!